Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Mark Translation Notes webinar. This is Mark 15:25 through 28. This is a new layout for GoToWebinar. Some of you were just with me a moment ago for the overview of Isaiah. Others of you, this may be the first time seeing it. Thanks for the confirmation in the questions box that audio and video are good. Yeah, the layout has changed. I just mentioned briefly before this was unbeknownst to us. And so we had to reschedule the Wednesday webinar due to technical difficulties, but I think it's smooth sailing today. It certainly was in the last webinar. So again, you should be able to see my screen and hear my voice and access the handout. The layout has changed. It is still the case that if you have questions or comments at any time, you can type them into the questions box and I will see those and respond just as I have in the past. We are also recording today's session, so you will get, if you're here live, you'll get a link to this handout, both to the handout and the session itself. The handout is also housed at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That's a shortcut to a Google Drive, and you can always email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. And the handout's here somewhere in the GoToWebinar control panel. I think there's a section probably called handouts or materials. It might be called materials now. All right, so without further ado, let's do what we do, which is work our way through a portion of the Greek text of Mark. This is Mark 15:25 through 28. I think it may have been mistitled in the webinar itself. And if you haven't been to translation notes, and even if you have, just a reminder that we primarily discuss lexical and grammatical questions that arise when translating the Greek text, in this case of Mark, into English. And so what does this word mean? We pay attention to how it might be used elsewhere, what that means for translation, and we'll see grammatical questions that come up. Why is this in the present now and in the aorist in the next verse? That will come up today, for example. And in the end, what we want is a smooth, readable translation that is faithful to the Greek text. And we've experienced as we've gone through this book that sometimes that can be a tension when we realize, of course, that no language goes into another exactly one by one, word for word, because languages differ, structures differ, word order differs. So I'm not sure we want to think in terms of compromising, but there is a balance or a push-pull there that we feel sometimes. And so as that comes up, we'll address it. And typically my goal is just to offer options. I'm not sure I'm going to, uh, you know, be overly prescriptive in translation, although in the end you do have to decide on a translation. So I will offer you what I've got here. Mark 15:21 through 24. This is from last time. And they, the soldiers, forced a certain passerby to carry his cross, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming from the country. Then they led him to the place called Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. And they gave him, of course, this is Jesus. We don't have the referent here, but this is Jesus. They gave him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for who would take them. So now we get to verse 25, and let me just start before we dive into the Greek with a little bit of orienting. I'll read you my translation first, and then we'll get into the Greek of it. But it's going to go on to say it was the third hour, and they crucified him, which, as you're reading straight through, might feel a little funny. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes. It was the third hour, and they crucified him. That's a pretty wooden translation, as close to the Greek as possible. And so we might just wonder about this together in translation, and I'll offer what I think is a suggestion, a good suggestion, hopefully, for why we get this repetition here. But let's go to accordance, and I'm in the NA28. This time I've got the one with sigla, and so all of these annotations in the text are showing up, and that's in particular because there's one today that we're going to look at in depth. But for now, we'll just read through the text itself. Ein de hora trite, kai estaurosan auton. Pretty short verse, and it reads now or and or but. It was the third hour, and they crucified him. And in my translation, I've kept it pretty much like that. It was the third hour, and they crucified him. I'm taking the day as pleonastic, which means it's not translated into English per se. We're seeing day and kai all over the place with Mark. They don't always need to be translated and, or they could be. That's really up to you and your translation philosophy. But I've made the point that sometimes kai or even day can serve kind of as like a capital letter or almost a punctuation mark in a manuscript that didn't have differentiation between uppercase, lowercase, different punctuations, things like that. So that's well within the range of possibility. Again, decide on a case-by-case basis. Different translations do this differently. I don't feel strongly about this. This is just how I've rendered it here. So there are two things that I want to note about this supposed repetition. It is the same verb that we've got with crucify. And we could see that by hovering over the word and looking in the instant details, staurao. You could also triple click to find it in our default Greek lexicon. I think we looked at this word a little bit last time. Verse 24 had this same verb in the present. So a literal translation would be, and they crucify him, as if it's a live look at the scene. There's this like vividness, I think, to that some folks call it the historical present. And now we've got, notice this prefixed epsilon, we've got estaurosan. So this is the aorist. They crucified him. So there are two things happening here, at least. One is that it's the same verb and the same crucifixion moving from present to aorist. So I think some of that is just changing the viewpoint of the action. So that's one possible explanation. So whereas here we just get the present giving us the up close, and here it is. So they crucify him. That's it. And then this is more background information. It was the third hour, and they crucified him. That's one way to understand this. In fact, you'll pardon the typo there. This should just say, and it was the third hour. The ESV, among others, says it was the third hour when they crucified him. That's my emphasis. The word hati, Greek word for when, is not in here. We've got kai. You might say, can you translate kai as when? Well, if you consider that this aorist here is giving us background information to what was already described in verse 24. Yeah, I think that's a great translation. So the move from present to aorist is, I think, giving us now background information. If verse 24 is the scene itself, verse 25 is kind of stepping back and saying, it was the third hour when they crucified him. So again, same act as described in 24, now just with some background information. That's one way to understand it. So you've got like the ESV and others will do that. And I think I would too in a final translation. I would not leave it this way. Although the King James has it, and it was the third hour, and they crucified him. So it's really just going as word for word, as left to right as it possibly can. Again, all this will come down to translation philosophy. I do think, though, that even if our goal is to be as one-to-one as possible, I think that's got to take into account the shift from present to aorist. And I think this when here with some background information is at play. So that's one explanation. That's, I think, one reason why we get from they crucified him, why we get it twice in a row is that one is kind of up close and the other is viewing this maybe more from a distance, but still as a singular event, but it's just giving us the time. The second thing I think is going on here, and this is very much a point of interpretation. I noted this 2 weeks ago. Mark has already been shifting a lot between present and aorist and imperfect in the verses that preceded this one, even while describing the same scene. Now, there could be a simple explanation, which is just he reached for this particular aspect or this particular tense, and that's just what he did, just changing it up for poetic variation. I think it's also possible, and this is maybe reading 21st century concepts onto a first century text, but there is a certain timelessness to this scene, both in terms of how it might apply today and also in terms of how Jesus would have experienced it. We looked in more detail 2 weeks ago just about the extreme abuse that Jesus was suffering. And I talked about how those traumatizing events would have the effect on anyone of not a good timelessness, but like a feeling of disconnected from time. Like where even am I? You know, it just feels interminable. So I wonder, and again, I acknowledge this is a point of interpretation. I haven't seen this anywhere else, so I could be way off base here. But I just wonder if Mark's variation between present, aorist, and imperfect, even when describing the same scene, I wonder if that has to do with the out of time experience that an abused, traumatized person can feel, where time just feels totally ruptured. Everything, the whole space-time continuum can feel broken. Again, that's a little bit of reading a concept onto the text that Mark may not have intended to be there, or he may have. I don't think I can say with certainty, but at least as I read it and I notice the shifting back and forth, that makes sense to me. Like, okay, if that's true, that Mark wants to evoke a sense of disorientation with regard to time, that would be a great way to do it, to move me from present to aorist to imperfect. So that's the second reason I think this could be moving into aorist. Of course, a simpler explanation with this particular verse is just that Mark is giving us this background information. All right, so what is this background information and how do we translate it? Well, on the one hand, it's easy to understand hora trite as the third, so the third hour, hour number 3. That's not a hard translation to make in a sense. The question is this going to make enough sense to the readers of the translation that we're going to leave it here? Some translations will go ahead and do the math and say, all right, well, we're talking the third hour from sunrise, third hour of the day, if the day is reckoned as hour 0 being sunrise, and, you know, let's say 6 o'clock sunrise, 9 o'clock. And so you'll see certain translations that will do that. That's a question to decide in translation. Do I want to keep this as the third hour? Do I want to translate it to 9 o'clock? And again, that's really just something for you to decide. Another kind of in between way is if you want to preserve the actual Greek wording and have your readers see that Mark is saying third hour, maybe a footnote here would make sense. That is 9 o'clock in the morning. Craig Keener, in his IVP New Testament background commentary, says the third hour began shortly after 8:30 a.m. and ran till shortly after 9:30 a.m. The exact time of hours would vary according to the time of sunrise from which they were reckoned, hence according to the season of year. I am particularly aware of this dynamic as in Boston I watch the sunset begin at 4:10 p.m., which is way too early if you ask me. But that doesn't have a whole lot to do with this passage, except to say that it changes throughout the year. And so, you know, we're talking about roughly an estimate here, one way or the other. The real question, though, is do you translate it as third hour or 9 o'clock? You can look at a glance via live click at different translations by clicking on finding the verse, clicking on the reference, and you can just look at here's the ASV, Berean third hour, here's 9 in the morning, third hour. You're going to see a split. And again, this really comes down to what are we trying to do in translation. And so here in the, here's a Spanish translation where it says, era la hora tercera. It was the third hour. And then they do that footnote. The footnote says, i.e. las 9 de la mañana. That is 9 in the morning. So that to me would be a really good way forward, but that's a decision I think in the end for the translator to make. Let me go back to this France quote, which I skipped over, and then we'll stop for questions and comments on this first verse. Here's RT France, And this gets into a potentially much broader study. So I'm just summarizing it here, and we're going to come back to time again in this account as we go on. But here's what France says in this this part of his commentary, summarizing time in Mark's account. He says the transfer of Jesus to Pilate began pro e, verse 1. And we could go back and look at that, confirm. Which we have seen to mean probably around daybreak. And the trial, which does not seem in Mark's account to have been very protracted, the soldiers' mockery, and the walk to Golgotha would need no more than 3 hours together. I think somebody asked last week about this. And yeah, I mean, and as we looked at this in context, we don't get transition words along the way. So this, I mean, this is a pretty close read of the text here, in the sense that you know, France is telling us historically this could all have happened within 3 hours, moving from Pilate to the cross. That is from daybreak to 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And Mark doesn't give us any indication that time has changed. So anyway, this all tracks with the text. So France goes on, the following account of nearly 9 hours on the cross. Can you imagine? With 3 hours of darkness from noon to the 9th hour, so noon being the 6th hour, and that's verse 33 through 34, as their middle point, the body being removed opsias genamenes, before the Sabbath began at the 12th hour. He says all of that is entirely plausible and self-consistent. Even on this time scale, Jesus' death before sunset was remarkably soon after he was placed on the cross. So here's the primary suggestion I would make. Again, this is a question for you to decide in translation, but whatever you decide, you'll want to be consistent throughout. So if you end up saying the 3rd hour here, you're going to want to say the 6th hour when you see the 6th hour in the text. You won't want to all of a sudden switch to 12 noon. If you say 9 o'clock in the morning here, switch to 12 noon when you get to the 6th hour, you know, rather than kind of going back and forth. So whatever you do, I would suggest being consistent. And I will say too, as we transition to your comments and questions and ideas, that there is, of course, the challenge of what do we do with the parallel accounts where the times may seem to differ, or certainly the text differs. How do we reconcile that? That's a wonderful question that has kept very brilliant minds occupied quite gainfully for 2,000 some years. And so the best resource for that I can recommend, and there are others, of course, but Raymond Brown's The Death of the Messiah is going to go into great detail on that. You'll even see just initially in some of your study Bibles. So here's a cross reference. Here's John. They said they divided. Okay, let me skip ahead to verse 25. Might need to go forward on that. Anyway, we're going to get some different timing. I'm not finding it readily here, but your study Bibles are going to speak to this question, and somebody like Raymond Brown is going to get much more in depth on it. This is what I'm looking for. Mark records Jesus' crucifixion as occurring at the 3rd hour, or 9 o'clock in the morning. John 19:14, here it is, gives the time as around the 6th hour, or noon. And then the way forward here, according to this study Bible, is these are rough estimates of time, but this is just scratching the surface. And I only mention it to acknowledge it. If you're thinking about the other Gospels, this is something to consider. If your goal is to reconstruct a full-bodied narrative of what happened using all available sources, this question will come up. In translating Mark, if the goal is translating Mark, we just take Mark on Mark's own terms. And so we don't reconcile anything across Gospels. We just translate Mark. I mean, there's a simplicity to that. And what I appreciate about this France quote is he puts everything all together and shows us how all of these times work, and how, yes, in fact, you know, we can verify historically 3 hours would have been enough time to move from point A to point B. So I find this a helpful quote and overview. Of course, we will come back to these verses. We're just in up to verse 28 today. So we'll look at the timing again, and you might even make a chart of this or maybe find one in your commentaries, but I wanted to include this with the giant quote mark to make it stand out for reference for the future. So that's what we've got. It was the third hour when they crucified him, about 9 o'clock in the morning. And that was a lot of comment on one verse, but I wanted to treat that time question because it's important. And, Mark had just said early before in 15:1, but he's going to give us specific hours now, whether they're meant to be estimates or not. So I want to have us pay attention to that as we go. What questions or comments do you have about verse 25? Move to verse 26. Let's go to accordance for that. Kai ein he epigraphe tes aitias autou epigegramene ha basileus ton Eudaion. And there was the epigraph charging him written, the King of the Jews. Now this ain goes with epigegramene. It sounds a little redundant. This might be a good time to open up your diagrams and see how this is all structured together. But let me go to the PDF here. Translated, and the inscription of the charge against him. So we've got the subject here is he epigraphe, the genitive tes of the charge against him, read, the King of the Jews. We know this title already. It's not ever really used in Mark in an honoring way. It's a mockery. And we know this by now. If we were to just read this verse by itself with no context, we might wonder, but we don't wonder. Epigraphe gives us the English epigraph. If you go to dictionary.com, it will say something like written on. BDAG, Bauer, Donker, Arndt, Gingrich lexicon says this is ordinarily used of a document incised on stone, but also of identifying notices on any kind of material. So it doesn't have to be stone. It's just something is written or inscribed or superscribed. And so the only difference there would be that an inscription it's just written in. So you get script for writing an in, and then super would be above. You could call this a superscription in translation. I would wonder if I don't know that any translations do that. There we go. It didn't take long to prove me wrong. Here it is, ASV and therefore the King James superscription. That is not a word that I think would really have broad familiarity today, at least not as much as inscription. I think the question is, do you want to show this as being above Jesus? And then superscription does that, weigh that with, is that a word that my readers are going to understand, or that is that kind of the level that I'm pitching this translation at? So superscription, maybe you also know that word from the Psalms. And so like the heading to the Psalms of David, when he was running from Absalom, or whatever information you get to the tune of do not destroy. Those are all superscriptions. So that's how we can understand epigraphe, either translated inscription or superscription. So that's fastened to the cross. And it's a superscription or inscription of tes aitias autou, of the charge against him. Let me close live click and then triple click that word again. That which is responsible for a condition, cause, or reason. And here we've got more specifically a basis for legal action. And even more specifically, BDAG gives us a charge, a ground for complaint. I think charge is a great word. It's a good legal word. You could say accusation here in translation. And the inscription of the accusation against him read, the King of the Jews. That would not be wrong. I think the mockery of it already speaks for itself in context. So I think even just the more neutral charge would be sufficient here. There's a note in the New English translation. I put it in the handout. It says, mention of the inscription is an important detail because the inscription would normally give the reason for the execution. I mean, if you think about a tombstone and, here lies so and so, and then whatever summary statement they want to say. The note goes on, it shows that Jesus was executed for claiming to be a king. It was also probably written with irony from the executioner's point of view. So the idea here is this is probably written in a mocking. I mean, I don't know that there's a probably about it. There's two ways you can understand this, and maybe they overlap. On the one hand, this is a continued uh, mocking use of this phrase, the King of the Jews. It's never used in Mark about Jesus favorably. We've seen it on Pilate's lips, and it's all in, kind of, are you the King of the Jews? And maybe there's some sincerity in how he asks it, but it's not actually an honorific in Mark. So yes, mocking on that count. And a second way to think of this is that it is naming the charge. So mocking or not, and you'd have to fill this out, and I wouldn't necessarily do that in translation because it's not there. But aitios together with the phrase, you could understand this too as something like, here is crucified the one who claimed to be the King of the Jews, or the charge that we are bringing against him is, and then it's implied, he claimed to be the King of the Jews. So that's not in Mark. That's not something I would bring out in translation because I don't think it's there explicitly in the text, but that's the idea. So, and maybe it's both. Maybe it's both that Mark wants to show us that this is the charge and that they're putting it up there, kind of labeling him, but of course in a mocking way. This phrase, habasileus ton Judaion, it would be good to do a search again, as we've done. You're going to want to right-click, search for the lexeme, and I'm just going to scroll ahead to Mark. So Mark 15, let me just open up a parallel here. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Again, we talked about with what intent is he asking that? Surely here, do you want me to release the King of the Jews? I mean, that does not feel very sincere. Same here. And in fact, we even get, this was a textual variant, but the han legete, the one you call. And so by the time we get to Mark 15:26, this will be the final use of this phrase. But in none of these instances is this actual homage to Jesus. So yeah, the charge against him, again, the question is, do you bring this out more in translation? I'm not sure you do. You certainly can if you want, but I think some kind of note somewhere would probably be helpful. But again, in context, reading straight through Mark 15, I know we're just doing a few verses at a time, but if you were to read straight through your translation of Mark 15, I think the mockery here, the fact that this is not seeking to accurately label what the crucifiers believe about Jesus, I think that would come out pretty clearly. And then finally, I note ein epigramene is red, pronounced like the color, R-E-A-D. So the inscription of the charge against him, read. You could do said, but it's not verbal. I mean, we say said when we're quoting authors of written words, so that would be fine. But because the emphasis here is writing, we have epigrapho. We have that same root here. You get the duplication here, but you have that same, you can see the remnant of the stem, graphe here. So I would keep that in the realm of writing. So the inscription read is how I would translate that. All right, let's pause there and see what questions or comments you've got. Let me just respond to these. Okay, so somebody says France's 9 hours on the cross seems too long. Jesus needs to be in the tomb before the 12th hour. And getting body off cross, prep as for burial as described, lots of spice, some more like 8 hours max. All right. Thank you for that. Also, getting 3 civil trials and beatings in between 6 and 9 is a bit of a stretch. Yeah, I mean, there's really a lot packed into here. So I think, my approach to this and again, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, but my approach would be exactly what those questions are doing. Start with what Mark says. And I mean, for me, I might need to get off a computer and do pen and paper for this one, but make a chart or whatever is helpful with the hours, list all the stuff, use them, bold them, highlight them in your text, and list all the stuff under them. So start with what Mark has, and then ask those kinds of questions. If you conclude there's no way this could have happened along Mark's time frame, you've got to answer the question, what do I do with Mark's time frame? And there are two ways, I mean, there are two levels at least on which to answer that. One is at the level of translation. The other is at the level of interpretation. And just one possible way forward is Mark maybe isn't seeking to give a detailed timeline, and he's giving estimates. So that would be one way, and historically folks have resolved it that way, especially when you cross-check this against other gospels where you get different times mentioned there. That may not be a satisfying interpretation to you because you see Mark give these hours, and maybe you think, well, there's no estimating about it. I mean, maybe within the 30 minutes, but he's giving us the hours he's giving us. So there is an interpretation question there. So yeah, I appreciate your bringing that up. And like I said, very brilliant minds for 2,000 years have worked on this. And I don't think you'll have to search very far in your commentaries before you'll find some kind of a chart laying all of this out. Certainly Brown in Death of the Messiah will treat this at length. But yeah, those are great comments and questions, and thank you for that. Anything else? Yeah, here's a question. Are you able to paste in people's comments as before? Let me try, and you can tell me if this works. I have put a question in the chat, and so I guess I'll need to know from you all if that comes through. Oh, yeah, here's a great comment. I'll put this in the chat. Yeah, thank you. Somebody says Mark 15:1 does not give 6 a.m. That's right. It states early morning, which could be much earlier. Yeah, great point. That's right. So Mark is not giving hours then. And let me know, by the way, if these comments are coming through. I've put them in the chat so that people can see them. Yeah, Mark 15:1, and we'll just briefly look at this. By the way, here's something cool. Did you know this? If you forget to change between words and verses in accordance and just start typing, I'm typing Mark. It thinks I'm searching for a word because I have it set to word, but it changes it automatically. So most of the time, I don't even bother to toggle between this. Anyway, that's kind of a cool feature. Yeah, so you get Pro-E, early in the morning. That's right. So the question is the early part of the daylight period. So, how literally are we taking daylight here? But yes, I mean, certainly this is a word that there seems to be more estimating here than when he's saying third, sixth, ninth, and so forth. So that's a great point. And so really again, back to like charting this all out. I mean, if you're trying to make a timeline, I think where you start is you get some anchor words, for lack of a better phrase. So this is one, what are all the time words? You don't need things like when or but and, but start with Pro-E and then get to the next one, which is the third hour. Oh, good. Comments are showing. Okay, great. And somebody asked about taking a screenshot in the new format, and I'm not sure how to do that other than I would think that's something internal to your computer rather than with the format, but I'm not sure how the new formatting might affect that or not. Okay, good. Somebody said we see your response in chat, but not in our questions window. Okay. All right, screenshot is on the right side in the middle. Okay, so maybe there is a screenshot tool within GoTo. So that's great. Thank you for that. Let me just put that in the chat in case that's helpful to others. Thanks for your patience as we navigate the new tech just when you thought you had a platform figured out. Okay. Great. All right, keep the comments and questions coming. I think we're all caught up. Let's go to verse 27. New information. Verse 27, I'll go to accordance in that. kai sun auto staurusin duo lestas, hena ecdexion kai hena exuonumon autu. And with him they crucify, back to the present tense again. Again, my two thoughts. Number one, we're not background information. It's kind of up close and personal. Number two, there's this kind of rupture in time that happens. However you read it, back to the present. Just note that. And with him, they crucify two, I'm going to say, violent criminals. One on his right, or one at his right, or at his right hand, and one on his left. All right, let's look at this in translation. And with him, they crucified two violent criminals, one on his right and one on his left. I just note here what I said a moment ago, staurusin, back in present tense again, vividly at the scene, whatever else you want to make of that. It's a lot of switching in these, dozen or so verses. All right, so who is crucified here? Well, we don't get names in verse 27. We just get kind of who they are in terms of behavior or category of person or something like that. This is from Lestes. And we go back to Mark 14:48. When I was preparing for today, I thought that word looks really familiar. And I did a word search, and it took me to Mark 14:48, and I remembered that we talked about it then. So here's Mark 14:48. Kai apokrithes ha Jesus epinautois. Then Jesus responded, Hos epilestein, eseothate metamakairon kaizulon sulabein me. This was my translation from then. Then Jesus responded, have you really come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? You could translate this any number of ways. This is just a copy paste of my notes from 1448. BDAG gives us robber, highwayman, bandit, revolutionary, insurrectionist, guerrilla, one who robs by force and violence. France says a pejorative word. Josephus, a technical term for particular people, part of a movement, one who stirs up rebellion. That's a lot of options. Those are a lot of options. I'm going to just say, because before I puzzled through this and decided that violent criminals was the translation, I'm going to keep it the same here. Now, if you puzzled through it and thought differently back then, I would just preserve your same translation. And we talked more then in that webinar, which of course the recording is posted, about translating then. If you think violent criminals is too broad, if you do agree with France. I mean, if you think Josephus is using this as a technical term for members of the Zealot, and if you think that applies here, that would affect your translation. The most important thing to me would be to be consistent from Mark 14:48 to here, because I think it's not explicitly saying Jesus predicted that he would be crucified next to two violent criminals, but I don't think this is lost on Mark's readers. Mark's listeners, that the same word is used here. So Jesus knows. I mean, he's being treated like this kind of a person, and it's being confirmed here. He's being detained like a violent criminal, and now he's being crucified like a violent criminal. So there's more here in the notes, and you could do a word study on that. I won't repeat all of that, but two violent criminals, one on his right and one on his left. So once again, Jesus called it. He prophesied it. Here's the net note, NET, New English Translation. Josephus, they don't go with that. They do say it talks about a figure of violence. I think for me, it doesn't seem like Mark is necessarily concerned about what specific crimes they committed. So I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about, well, were they insurrectionists? Were they robbers? Was it assault? I mean, you could do some research on that and maybe you'll find something. But I think what Mark is wanting to say, two things. Number one, same word that Jesus said, so that's important. And number two, these are criminals of some kind that should be there according to the conventions of the day. I mean, whatever your view on capital punishment might be, according to the conventions of that day, they're supposed to be there. And that's what that word is trying to communicate, that they are violent criminals. They are guilty. Jesus, of course, is not. So there's more irony there and even tragedy. But yeah, that's a key word to really think about. And whatever you decide, I would just match what you had done before. So the mockery continues. We'll pause here for comments and questions, but I couldn't help but notice that we've got a multi-directional mockery. I mean, you've got this superscription, and assuming that really is above him. I mean, if we take super literally and that's above him, we've got King of the Jews kind of mocking him from above. At his right, there's a violent criminal, which is just making a mockery of Jesus's death. And at his left, I'll clean up that typo. I'll get a new handout uploaded and you'll get it in your email too. But at his left, there's another violent criminal. We don't get, let's just skip ahead here and see. Yeah, we're not going to get the criminals actually talking here in Mark's account, but they don't need to talk to be mocking Jesus by their very presence. I mean, the whole thing is a farce. So I just thought that was interesting, this directional at his left and at his right with the superscription above him. I mean, he's just surrounded by mockery. And I don't think Mark's readers need really any convincing at this point that Jesus shouldn't be there. I mean, if you read Mark's gospel and take it as true, by the time you get here, I mean, this is just absurd. But you get this kind of spatial up high at the left, at the right. That this mockery continues even in this moment. So those criminals, in addition to being there historically, I think rhetorically they function as more elements of the mockery. Let's pause there and see what you've got for questions or comments. Okay, here's just a logistics question, and I'll put this in the chat. Somebody says chat only appears when you activated it. It appears that we are not able to add anything to chat as set up currently, which is how it was before. Whether that's how we want it to be is another question. So I will look into that. But thank you for letting me know. That's at least consistent with before. So we have something there. Another comment, somebody says Roman culture excelled at theater. Yeah, I mean, this is among many other things. It's just a very dramatic scene. Somebody says Mark 14:48, insurrectionist likely includes killing, since all three criminals, earlier includes Barabbas, were sentenced to capital punishment, cross penalty. Yes, and thank you for mentioning Barabbas. He is not here. and he should be. I mean, he's physically, historically not here, but he's also not here in the narrative. And it's easy to forget about the people that are not in the text. But as readers, I think it's good to just pay attention. Like who's not, just like if you were having a meaningful conversation to make a decision, one question people would ask is who's not at the table, who needs to be? Well, that's a great question. Who's not up on the cross? Who should be right here? And again, not should be in the sense that you want people to die. Like it doesn't have to do with your view of capital punishment per se. But again, according to the conventions of the time, who should be here? So yes, thank you for bringing up Barabbas. And interesting too, the insurrectionist likely includes killing. I think if you confirm that through your research, I think the word violent therefore is even more justified. If you are 100% sure that these are all murderers, or that the two violent criminals are, you could even say they crucified two murderers. With him, they crucified two murderers. So I think I've kind of split the difference a little bit with violent criminals here, just because I see so many options for translation. But yeah, I think if you get more specific in your research and see something like murderers there, then go for it in translation. Okay, great. Thanks for confirming. Just one more logistical note. Somebody says we can type in questions. Your response shows in chat. Okay, good to know. So that's as it was before. All right, any other comments or questions about verse 27? Let's go to verse 28. Now, you may ask the question, what verse 28? And you would be quite right to ask that question, because look at this. This is the NA 28. I've got 25. I've got 26. I've got 27. I've got 29. Same in the Net Bible. And there's a note. There's always a note, which is good. You're not imagining things. The first thing I would check, and this is just kind of a technical detail in accordance, the first thing I would check in a case like this with an apparent missing verse is that my context slider is all the way at A. For example, when you do word searches, and I'll just, well, we won't do this, but if you did a word search and found a really commonly occurring word and you thought it was supposed to be in every verse, but you only saw some verses, actually, let's do an example. This is easier to explain by an example. Let's go to the Net Bible. I'm going to type in the word the. Same thing. Remember what I said before about most of the time you don't need to bother toggling. I was set to verses. I typed in the. It knows that's a word. All right, so here's an example. Now, I would expect to see the in just about every verse, but in this case, I'm reading through and it looks like everything's here, but verse 3 is missing. Well, that's just because the word the is not there. Sliding the context slider to A is going to show me here's verse 3, and that is correct that the word the isn't there because there's nothing in bold and red. So, all right, we found the verse that way. That's always the first thing I would try. Am I doing a hit search and that's why? Well, no, we're not. Right? We're in the text. It should show, and we even have the context slider slid to A. So what's going on here? Well, there's a textual variant. There's a question about whether this verse belongs in the surface text or not. Now, as a translator, personally, and again, as always, feel free to disagree. In my own translation, if I were publishing it, I would not personally do a 27 and a 29 like this. I think it's confusing because your readers are going to go looking for it. The easy way to solve this is put it right away in the footnotes, as the NET Bible does. I don't know a good alternative way, though, because what's happening here is that the editors of the Greek New Testament are certain enough that this verse is not supposed to be in the text that they footnote it. And yet you've got the numbering that it was assigned a number at some point as verse 28, so that you can't just call this verse 28. So I don't know what a better solution is. I do know that personally, I find this solution confusing because you don't have a number, whether it's in Greek or English. Again, context slider is all the way up at A, but you're going to have footnotes. And this is the kind of thing that, when we translate, there's a question of what do we footnote? What would be better as a commentary or notes or whatever? This always will be footnoted. I mean, I think you'd be very hard pressed to find a translation that didn't. And you could live click and look at that. All right, well, you've got a note here in the Net Bible. Most later manuscripts add 1528. And the scripture was fulfilled that says he was counted with the lawless ones. And then we have basically a summary of why this is omitted. The NA28 itself, and this is why I have the Sigla version, is going to have a note here, and it comes right here. And there's lots of different, Sigla and manuscript abbreviations to look at. It's going to give you the evidence where it is, where it isn't. I'm going to just skip right ahead to Metzger and Comfort, which are two text commentaries. And you can find, in fact, if you just type in text commentary, that will take you to both. So both of these are in your handout. Metzger notes omit verse A. So there's a high level of certainty that in the surface text, the verse should be omitted. In other words, if we could imagine what Mark had initially written, like the earliest, most reliable text, according to Metzger and committee, this verse is not there. And he talks about the earliest and best witnesses of the Alexandrian and the Western types of text lack verse 28. And then he talks about, well, why is it here? It's understandable the copyist would have added it in the margin from Luke 22:37, which here it is, whence it came into the text itself. There's no reason why, if the sentence were present originally, it should have been deleted. So that's a principle of text criticism, is to figure out where did it come from, what would explain its being there. Is it plausible that it would be there and then deleted? Was it there in the first place? So whether you agree with that or not, you can see the thinking behind it. And then here's Comfort, which I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just, that quote is there. So the translation question, and we'll actually translate the verse here, but the translation question is, what do you do with this in terms of the numbering? I suppose one solution would be keep it all in the surface text and put the whole thing in parentheses. So you could put the whole thing in parentheses or gray font or something like that and keep it all on the surface with the number 28. Then you don't have the potential confusion of skipping numbers. The downside to that, so I can argue against myself on that, the downside to that is if you kind of follow these other folks and do your own work and think the same thing, that this really shouldn't be part of the surface text, the downside is then you've put it there. So maybe it should be relegated to a footnote. This is a true trade-off. I don't see an easy way forward here, one way or the other. So you'll have to decide how to handle this. But we're doing a very brief overview of this. You could check these sources, and your Greek commentaries, your more technical commentaries, are going to treat this as well. France will always talk about, I shouldn't say always, but just about always, he'll have the text variants treated here. Let me just pull that up. Yeah, see the textual note for the omission of verse 28. So that'll be up in his translation. I know I'm scrolling quickly, but you'll find here where he does that, which is before the commentary. Let's just see what he says briefly, and then we'll translate it. Actually, let's not. It's there. All right. He talks about it. Let's talk about translating this. So we've got, now I could show this in accordance. This is where your Greek really gets put to the test, because when you click this open in your in your apparatus, this is not pointed, or it's not, you don't have the accents and the breathing marks. Maybe that's a little easier in Greek than Hebrew. You do have it in Luke 22:37. So you could see how closely that follows it. And there it's not only pointed, but you've got instant details, which you don't here. So you could just see how much does that match. But let's just try it this way. We've got eplerothe, hegraphe, legusa, kai meta anomon, elogiste, and was fulfilled from plerao, or is that plereo? The scripture here. I'm just going to check this so I don't steer you wrong. Yeah, see, I want to use this too. Actually, we have telestheni. We have a different word for fulfilled. All right, thus was fulfilled, hegraphe, the scripture, which says, so we have a feminine participle, which is modifying the feminine singular nominative of the scripture. Thus was fulfilled the scripture which says, and with the lawless he was reckoned. Reckoned might be too technical a term. You could say counted, considered as, treated as. I just want to note, and I know we're coming up to time here, the continued I want to note the continued use of this graph root, which is right here, hegraphe. So whether this is intentional or not, hard to say, but we had the inscription, which reads the King of the Jews. And this is a writing that is a mockery. You could even call it blasphemous if you want to go that way. Here, whether part of Mark's initial text or not, here is a true writing, a not mocking writing, a graphe, same root, which talks about what's actually happening here. So the King of the Jews in fact, it's true, though they don't know it, but it's not meant to be true. Well, here's almost like a written palate cleanser for the readers and the disciples and the followers of Jesus who are distressed by what's happening here. He was reckoned along with the lawless. Maybe that's not all that encouraging, because he shouldn't be reckoned along with the lawless, but it's at least describing what's happening here in terms of fulfillment. Different word from Leistain, what I was translating as violent criminal, but same idea. A lawbreaker, convicted criminal, something along those lines. All right, we're going to stop there because that actually takes us to the end of the passage. And I'd love to see any other questions or comments you've got. Well, I shouldn't say the end of the passage. It's just the end of today, because there's more. But we'll pause there with that enigmatic verse, just in the sense that we get this awkward, the awkward decision facing any translator. But let me see what questions and comments you've got. All right, somebody, yeah, let me just copy paste this in. Yes, great. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Let me put this in the chat so you can see what I'm responding to. Somebody says Mark uses present tense staurusin during the kinetic act of nailing to the cross both Jesus and insurrectionists. Yeah, verse 24 and 27. That's right. So I think that would, and I'm glad you bring that up kind of right next to each other. I think in both those cases, that historical present is giving us kind of the up close and personal, and like, yeah, here's the physical act right here. Great comment. Any other comments and questions, whether on this verse or anything else that we've covered? I just want to make sure I've covered all the questions. If I have not addressed your question, if it came earlier and I somehow missed it, please feel free to ask again. But I think I got everything. We are not having any webinars next week. I typically teach on Wednesday and Friday, which is Christmas Eve and the day after Christmas. So whether you are on Accordance or not on those days, I hope you all have a great week next week. We'll pick up next time. We are getting very close, believe it or not, to the end of Mark. And just to acknowledge again that we skipped some material in Mark 3 back when I thought I was only doing selections of this book, but it turned out we're doing the whole thing. So we will go back and cover those. If you've got any other comments or questions, there's the feedback form that I think you'll be taken to after this webinar, assuming that still works. Linda Perry and I will read those comments, questions. We'll get back to you on email. Yeah, thanks. Someone says Merry Christmas to you and yours, and to you all as well. Hope you have a great Christmas and holiday week and Advent season and New Year's and all that. Just a reminder that this handout is available at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes by the time you click there. So in 5 minutes from 12 o'clock Eastern, Friday, December 19th, it will be uploaded with a corrected version. The recording will come to you as well, and I'm going to end the recording now and stay on live for just a moment.